Welcome to Policy Implications. In this podcast, we dive into new research in economics and finance and ask what it means for policymakers in the real world. This season, we focus on Ukraine, the war, the economy, and the institutions that will shape the country's future. I'm your host, Olha Zadorozhna, an economist working on Ukraine and Ukrainian myself. This series is supported by the Economists for Ukraine network and Kozminski University. Today we are talking about something that has become painfully familiar for Ukrainians and recently became a shock for one of Europe's richest capitals, blackouts. Recently, parts of Berlin experienced a major power outage after an arson attack on high-voltage cables near a power and heating plant. Tens of thousands of households and thousands of businesses lost electricity, heating, and mobile networks, some for days in winter temperatures. It raised big questions about how vulnerable Europe's power systems are to targeted attacks and sabotage. At the same time, Ukraine is again living through very long electricity and heating blackouts after new waves of Russian attacks on energy infrastructure. This is not a one-off incident, but a sustained campaign that affects everyday life across the country. To talk about this, I'm joined by two great guests. First of all, Tatyana Deryugina, a distinguished economist and an associate professor of finance at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, with extensive work on environmental and energy issues. And second of all, I'm joined also by Ilona Sologoub, an economist, a policy expert, and head of Vox Ukraine, who is currently in Ukraine and living through these blackouts herself. Tatyana, Ilona, welcome to Policy Implications.
Thank you for having me here.
So, Ilona, I want to start with you because you're in Ukraine right now, and the situation with electricity and heating is very difficult again this winter. Before we talk about Berlin and Europe more broadly, I think it's important for listeners to understand what's happening today in Ukraine. So, Ilona, first of all, how are you? And can you describe what the current blackout situation looks like where you are in terms of electricity, heating, and in general, daily life?
Thank you for asking, Olga. The situation is difficult, but it depends on the district or on specific buildings. For example, the building where I am is more or less okay because we have our own heating power plant. But those buildings, the majority of buildings in Kyiv that are connected to central heating, stayed without heating for several days. And of course, situation there was very difficult, especially for elderly, for people with children, because now temperatures are minus 20 at night, and in the house it can be like plus 10 or even less. So the situation is difficult, but energy sector workers are working day and night to restore heating. So after the last large attack by Russians on Kyiv, practically all of the buildings are now with heating, but some 300 buildings, I think, remained without heating. But initially, like 6,000 houses were without heating. So it really took day and night work of the communal workers, and we are really grateful to them.
Oh, yes, they are heroes for sure. And for many people outside of Ukraine, a blackout might mean an hour or two without light and maybe some inconvenience. But in Ukraine, it's on a totally different scale, as you said, with repeated strikes and damage generation and plant outages. It's completely different. So, Ilona, if you had to explain to someone in Berlin or Paris or Madrid what a typical day looks like under these long blackouts for households, for schools, for shops, how would you describe it?
As I said, it's especially bad for children because schools also have quite low temperatures, and this affects schooling, and this also affects people whose health is not so good, although critical infrastructure objects like hospitals, they have power generators, and also many businesses have acquired generators during the last several years. So basically, we can walk into supermarkets, and many people use this. If they don't have heating at home, they walk into supermarkets or some other public buildings, and they can charge their phones, then they can stay warm. So there is like this communal support that people provide to each other. Businesses also allow people to just walk in and stay to be heated, to charge their phones, and so on. And many people have prepared for blackouts during the last several years. For example, I have in my household a power station. I have a small heating gas stove, so that when there is no electricity, I can cook something. People are surviving and learning to survive, but of course, with several days without heating, it's hard for everyone.
Oh, yes, definitely. But this is also part of Ukraine's resilience. And we will talk about it a bit later, what we can learn from it in Europe and beyond. But for now, let's shift to Berlin, and then we'll come back to those lessons from Ukraine. So recently, this arson attack on a cable bridge near a combined heat and power plant in southwest Berlin destroyed several high voltage and medium voltage cables. That cut electricity and district heating to tens of thousands of households and hundreds of critical facilities that include hospitals, care homes, and schools. And it took about 4 days to fully restore power. German media and officials called it the city's longest blackout since 1945, and investigators are treating it as a politically motivated attack on critical infrastructure. So, for listeners who don't follow energy policy, Tatyana, can you explain in simple terms why a single act of sabotage on some cables can knock out power for so many people in a city like Berlin? And what does this tell us about how modern power grids are built?
So, electricity has to flow everywhere at once. If there's a single point where something is disconnected, electricity stops flowing, and you have a blackout. Now, this is within a connected system, right? So you can also build a grid to have kind of islands that could be connected or could be isolated from one another. But within a given connected system, if you disrupt a critical part of it, everybody will lose lights. And in this case, if you've got a high voltage cable that feeds tens of thousands of households and that cable is cut, you've just disrupted the flow. And of course, it's a choice to how many of these, independent modular systems you want to have, where if they're disconnected, if one of them is malfunctioning for whatever reason, equipment failure or an act of sabotage, the other ones can still keep going. But of course, it's costly. It's often much easier to just have a single cable feeding into kind of being, the single provider of electricity to a large number of households. It's cheaper, there's less duplication, but it makes the system more vulnerable. Now, fundamentally, you cannot make the grid resilient to any sort of failure in the sense that just one household loses power and everybody else is okay, right? That would just be way too costly. So it's like preparing for a natural disaster. You can never set things up so that you're guaranteed that a natural disaster will cause no damage. You do cost benefit analysis about what are the cost effective methods of both building a resilient grid protecting a resilient grid, and most importantly, making sure that you have a system in place to minimize damage if an outage does happen, and restore power as quickly as possible. So I think there's lots of vulnerabilities that are similar to Berlin's in the European grid in general. Some of them are, again, probably unavoidable. I would not say that the European grid is the most vulnerable grid out there. It is just a fact of how modern grids are built. As long as not every household has their own power plant making electricity for them, you're going to have some risks of long-term outages that affect a lot of people.
For sure, maybe these independent power plants per household is the future. Who knows? We'll see what will happen. But we often think of energy security in Europe in terms of gas. For example, do we have enough gas, or are we too dependent on Russian imports? But this blackout in Berlin was not about fuel. It was about the wires and it was about infrastructure. So, do you see this event as a kind of wake-up call that energy security today is also about protecting the electricity network from physical attacks and sabotage, not just about where we get our gas from?
I certainly hope that it's going to be a wake-up call, not just to Berlin, but to other European countries, because what happened in Berlin could have easily happened, in Spain, in France, and so on. And we absolutely need to be worried about physical grid security, especially in this new world where Russia has conducted many acts of sabotage against Europe. And if anything, I'm sure the Russians have watched what happened in Berlin, and I mean, probably thought, oh, we didn't even think about trying to do this ourselves, but this is another way that we can cause damage. So if I were a European leader, I would be especially worried about physical grid security right now.
Definitely. And Ilona, back to you. So you watched Ukraine's energy system become a deliberate target in this war. When you saw the news about Berlin's blackout, a rich EU capital losing power and heat for days because of one targeted attack, what was your first reaction? And from Ukrainian perspective, how did this story look? Was it familiar? Was it shocking maybe?
I think something like this could be expected because we have seen a lot of acts of sabotage during the last few years, like cutting these internet cables or explosions in some production plants and so on. So it's not like we waited for this, but this was not really very unexpected. And I think that Russia may well be connected to this act of sabotage, to this far left group that implemented it. So I wouldn't be surprised, and I would suggest that special services investigate in this group where they get the money, who are they connected to, and so on. As for Ukrainians, it was quite surprising that German communal workers did not go out to repair it during holidays. Probably this signals some kind of relaxed mode in which Europe still functions. And I, as well as Tatyana, I indeed hope that something will be changed, that governments or city governments will realize that these things can happen and they should be prepared, and probably communal workers and citizens should be prepared as well.
And also, there was a story that actually Ukrainian refugees in Berlin were helping people. Have you heard of that?
No, I didn't, but I would imagine that the Ukrainian refugees would be doing this because that's what Ukrainians do, and probably they know this when communicating with their friends and relatives, that people are really helping each other and organizing.
Yes, exactly. They had experience and they could share it and help people, and that's what they did. So they set up the resilience areas where people could come, drink some tea, and charge their phones. And I'm very proud of Ukrainians doing that. But for many Germans, this blackout was a shock, and media called it unthinkable that such a thing could happen in one of the most advanced capitals in Europe. And also, energy experts, on the other hand, have been warning that European infrastructure is more vulnerable than people like to admit, especially to deliberate attacks. So, a question to Tatyana now. If you were explaining this to a policymaker in Berlin or Brussels, how would you describe the state of Europe's energy security today? Are we prepared for targeted attacks on grids and pipelines, or are we still thinking too much in terms of normal market shocks that happen, every day for us economists?
No, Europe is absolutely does not seem prepared for acts of sabotage. I'm sure the grid is well prepared for equipment failure, right? But I think Europeans still have not realized that the state of things have changed. And to your point about Ukrainian refugees helping out, I think this actually raises a very important point about population readiness. So we might also be thinking in terms of grid resilience. Okay, well, we just need to have repair crews on standby. We need to have enough spare equipment. Maybe we need to reorganize the grid so that we have more isolated areas so that there aren't large areas that can lose power at the same time. But at some point, you will still face the probability of massive blackouts, right? It is impossible to prevent. And even if those crews had gone out on the weekend, when you have a high voltage cable, they're specialized. You have to go, underground. You have to figure out exactly, especially when there is a fire, there might not be damaged in a single point, but in many different points. So even if you start repairing right away, repairs will still take time. And you have to prepare the population for these kinds of possibilities. So they do this quite well in Scandinavia with a total defense mentality where, you don't just yell at the government, bring me back my power. Of course, we should hold governments accountable, but people are also prepared to be without electricity for, let's say, 72 hours in the worst case scenario. They know where to go if it is cold. The government has prepared warming centers. It's communicated what people should be preparing, where those warming centers are. And Europe just doesn't do that, because luckily it hasn't had to deal with these kinds of events. But I do believe they're more likely in the future, and the population needs to be prepared. And of course, governments should also be prepared to repair the damage as quickly as possible.
Tatyana, you raised a very important point about communicating with the population. And this is something I wanted actually to address to Ilona, because Ilona, you watched Ukraine communicate about blackouts, about the schedules, about the emergency measures in much more extreme conditions of the war, basically. And what would you tell European politicians about communicating honestly with citizens on energy security? Are there any lessons to learn from Ukraine about how to talk about potential risks and preparedness without causing panic, but also without pretending then that everything is all right?
Well, I wouldn't say that Ukrainian government is the best example of communicating to people, but luckily we have quite a lot of experts who say that you should not panic, but you should be prepared. Yeah, you should have a plan. What if there is no electricity for 24 hours? What if there is no electricity for like 48 hours, and so on? Because also Ukrainian media landscape is affected probably by Russians who try to cause uneasiness, who try to make people go into the streets and make demonstrations against the government because they don't have power and so on. And it's important not to do this, understanding that communal workers and energy companies are doing whatever they can do, but people just need to stay calm, to support each other, and so on. But we have seen that a lot in Ukraine. So some media workers, I would say, so try to to cause panic. Oh, we are going to die this winter. This winter will be very hard, and so on. And it's important that the government communicates that it's not like that. That you should only be prepared, and other people, other experts should also talk to people and explain what they can do, rather than just to worry and to panic.
And I think the Russian strategy of causing the panic doesn't work so far, because Ukrainians were very calm, very resilient, very prepared. So I think their strategy is failing, which is a good thing, obviously. But let's turn more directly to what Ukraine has gone through and what Europe can learn from its experience. Because since October 2022, Russia has been systematically targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, the power plants, the substations, the transmission lines. And at some points, huge parts of the power system were out of action, and millions of people were living with rolling blackouts. Over time, of course, Ukraine strengthened air defense, rebuilt infrastructure, and even resumed electricity exports when capacity allowed. But as you said, Ilona, new attacks and long blackouts are still a reality. So I have a question to Tatyana now. From your energy economics perspective, what have we learned about the resilience of Ukraine's power system over these last winters, and what has worked surprisingly well, and where are the biggest weaknesses?
So I think the speed with which the energy infrastructure has been repaired has been really remarkable. And the coordination in terms of managing high electricity demands, rolling blackouts, that's also that's a very hard thing to do, to communicate to the entire population. Here's what the electricity schedule will be. And I think that's been done quite well. The biggest weaknesses, I would say, are similar to weaknesses in the European energy grid and many grids worldwide. A lot of the grid components are very specialized. So they're not like standard Lego bricks where if one is knocked out, you can easily replace it. This is especially true with transformers. A lot of them are custom built, very expensive to replace. And that's a weakness that's hard to address in the short term, because obviously you're not just going to take out a perfectly good transformer to replace it with something modular, and you can stock some spare parts, but if you're not sure exactly which one will get knocked out, it's very hard to prepare for. So that, I would say, is the biggest weakness. But the coordination of the population and the speed of the repair has really been remarkable, given how many attacks Ukraine has faced.
Definitely. And about the speed of repairs, so obviously we're really surprised and excited for the heroes of energy plants and workers that repair those damages very quickly. And so I wanted to ask Ilona, what are some concrete practices or innovations from Ukraine's energy war that you think Europe should pay attention to? Is there something to learn from Ukrainian innovation system in energy security?
Well, Ukraine introduced physical protection on transformers and on some power stations. But of course, when there is a direct hit by a missile, you cannot possibly protect a large power plant from that. So another lesson, I would say, is to use more the decentralized energy generation, And apart from small diesel generators that businesses have, Ukrainian cities have been buying gas power plants. These are like container size and they're quite small. But I would say that this change has not been happening as quickly as it should have been. So there is something that Ukraine could have done more efficiently. Specifically, some Ukrainian energy experts have been saying that some businesses could have installed these gas power plants themselves, but they have some regulatory barriers that slow it down or even prevented this installation of these power plants. So probably reviewing regulation and allowing more private initiative is what Europe would also want to do in case something like this happens there.
And let's bring this back to Berlin and EU more broadly, because the Berlin blackout was a small event compared to what Ukraine is going through, but it revealed serious gaps in protecting critical infrastructure, even in a rich, peaceful capital. Meanwhile, Ukraine, under constant attack, has been forced to innovate and build resilience very quickly, just what you, Ilona, mentioned. So, Tatyana, if you had to advise the mayor of Berlin or German energy minister, what are the 3 concrete steps you could recommend after these blackout, drawing on what we've discussed and what we've seen in Ukraine?
Yeah, so step number 1 is that the vulnerabilities need to be identified. So I'm fairly certain that the German government has no idea exactly where the vulnerabilities are, because grids do tend to be decentralized with some, municipal owned utilities. They were built over time. Nobody has like a big picture view, or not a big picture view, but the details, right, of the grid and where the most dangerous choke points are. And so as the government, the first thing you want to do is you want to know where those are. The second thing that I would do is population preparedness. So in the long run, of course, you can improve grid resilience. And, maybe if they find some really terrible choke points that clearly would benefit from some redundancy or decentralization, I would do that. But the number 1 main thing is to have a plan in place. So population preparedness is one. And the second one is utility preparedness. So, in the United States, after the financial crisis, banks have had to undergo so-called stress tests, where they have to show to the central bank that they can fail gracefully without disrupting the whole economy. We need to have utility operators undergo similar stress tests and not just take their word for it that, okay, we would be ready for scenario X, Y, and Z, but to actually have them practice and simulate these scenarios and like we do drills for fire evacuations. Utilities need to be doing drills for acts of sabotage and how they would respond to them. So those would be the first 3 things that I would do if I were in charge of Germany or any other European country. You don't want to wait until this happens to you. Again, this could have happened in other countries as well. Don't wait until it happens. Be prepared and plan for it.
These are great points. I hope the mayor of Berlin or other capitals in Europe listen to this podcast and they take these points to heart. And thinking about the European Union more broadly, not just Berlin. So, Ilona, what kind of Ukraine EU cooperation on energy security would you like to see? Are there specific areas like training, joint projects, or regulation where Ukraine's experience under fire could really help make the EU more resilient?
Sure, but first, before answering this question, I would like to add to Tatyana's point that it's important to recognize that Europe is already at war with Russia, or to formulate it more correctly, Russia has started the war on Europe, and so Europe should admit it and look more closely at the various political and other groups related to Russia, because you can find them quite openly. They receive money from Russia and so on. So investigation into these groups and I don't know, maybe strengthening punishment for acts of sabotage or for uh, promoting Russian influence in Europe would also be helpful, so that these people who would like to implement something like that knew that the punishment will be really serious. And as for Ukrainian experience, of course, Ukraine has a lot to share, like from providing scenarios for this stress testing that Tatyana mentioned, to describing various kinds of protection of energy grid and power stations and so on, to describing Russian tactics, because they are changing tactics a bit. For example, in 2022, they tried to destroy the distribution network in Ukraine, and last year they were hitting power generation. So they're like changing and trying different strategies. Now they are trying to implement complete blackout in several regions and also disconnect left and right banks of the Dnieper River, because most of generation is on the right bank and the consumption is on the left bank. So, this kind of tactics can also be documented and studied, whether European countries have something similar, or what could be the scenarios that they should prepare for.
Definitely. So we started this conversation by asking how you are, Ilona, living through long blackouts in Ukraine right now. And then we moved to a blackout in Berlin that shocked many Europeans. For people in Berlin, a few days without power and heat felt extraordinary. For Ukrainians, unfortunately, it is part of a much larger ongoing story. What your work and experience show is that Ukrainians are not just victims of energy warfare, they're also pioneers in energy resilience. And there is a lot Europe can learn from Ukraine about how to protect the grids, organize repairs, communicate with the public, and keep societies functioning under extreme stress. So Tatyana, Ilona, thank you both for this conversation, and thanks for joining me and discussing these issues. For the listeners, thanks for listening, and see you next time.
Thank you, Olga.
This has been Policy Implications. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and stay tuned for more conversations on Ukraine's economy, institutions, and the challenges of reconstruction. I also encourage you to donate to support Ukraine. You'll find information on trusted ways to do so in the episode description.